Well, it remains a fluid and evolving situation in the Middle East as Israel continues its targeting of the Iranian regime and the Iranian nuclear weapons program in particular. Iran, of course, in response, has lobbed a number of ballistic missiles toward Israel, but so far it does seem like maybe Israel has the upper hand in all of this. So, joining us for a closer look at the conflict, the threat posed by a nuclear Iran, and whether this could maybe help bring about an end to the oppressive regime in Iran, very pleased to welcome to the program Kaveh Shahrooz, a lawyer, human rights activist, also a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Kaveh, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Really good to be with you.
So, as I said, it does appear as though Israel's been successful thus far. It appears, on the other hand, that Iran seems somewhat weak and isolated. But is it too soon to start drawing conclusions about where this is all going?
Well, I think the conclusion you're drawing is to some extent the correct one. Israel is obviously the superior power here. Iran has practically embarrassed itself in the past few days. It has not been able to protect its own sort of top officials in its own cities. The Israelis seem to have complete control of Iranian skies and seem to be able to take out whatever military installation they want at will. Where I think it's difficult to draw a conclusion is kind of where all this will lead. I think Iran's regime will almost certainly is losing and will almost certainly lose. The question then is kind of what the political outcome of that will be. Does that mean that we just end up with an Islamic regime that's much weaker? Is the regime going to be toppled by its own citizens? Is it going to be toppled through this Israeli action? That part is the part that's unclear. But I don't think there's any scenario in which Iran ends up prevailing in this conflict.
Israel obviously saw needs, saw some urgency in responding. It's hard to know where Iran was at, but I mean, it's pretty clear that there was an aspiration there to become a nuclear power. What kind of a threat would that have posed?
I think a significant one. I don't think the Israelis were exaggerating the threat from Iran. Iran's regime for 40 years, 46 years, has made the elimination of Israel a key pillar of its so-called revolution. Not a week goes by where there's not some Iranian official of high rank talking about the fact that they want to wipe Israel off the map. They don't call it Israel; they call it a Zionist entity. And if it was just talk, I think maybe Israel could tolerate it. But it's not just this kind of genocidal talk. We saw it on October 7th, through its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Um, Iran has been wreaking havoc in the region, primarily, directed at Israel. So I think it's a perfectly reasonable position for the Israeli politicians and their security team to take to think that this is an existential threat. And I think they assessed the risk to be great, and they assessed Iran to be very close to developing that nuclear weapon, and that's why they
Right.
decided to take action now.
So, in the process, these strikes have targeted that infrastructure. They've also targeted senior Iranian leadership, and some really interesting stories emerging in recent days about which names might have been on that list. And I think a lot of Iranian officials, really, honestly, with a lot of blood on their own hands. What have you made of what we've seen and heard so far about some of the top Iranian leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there was a single person from the Iranian leadership that's been killed by these Israeli strikes. These very precise and I have to say, on some level, very impressive strikes. And I don't think there's a single person there that is innocent. We had the heads of various branches of the IRGC. The IRGC is responsible for mass killings in Iran, outside of Iran, the mass killing of a number of Canadians. I think the story of the Ukraine international flight PS752 that was shot down by the IRGC back in 2020. I think should be familiar to Canadians that watch this or listen to this. So I think anyone that's thinking of taking those positions now that these folks have been eliminated has really got to think about whether or not they want that job, because it seems like Israel can simply eliminate these folks at will. And I think the other thing that Israel's campaign has shown is just how much success they've had in infiltrating Iran's regime. It seems like in the past year and a half, Israel has just been able to kill whomever it wants
Yeah.
on Iranian territory. Be it the folks from Hamas that were visiting, or in the recent days with IRGC officials. I mean, you got to think these are the top officials of the country under the one would think the most secure sort of circumstances, and watched very closely. and Israel can just simply kill them whenever it wishes. So it's a regime that's shown itself to be incredibly weak, despite all its rhetoric.
So, what should we make of reports that we're hearing about Iranian leaders trying to flee the country, fleeing the country? I mean, it would be, I suppose, very clean and simple for this to all end by just the entire Iranian leadership abdicating. But is that probably wishful thinking at this point?
It's hard to say. We're operating in a very bizarre and polluted information space at the moment. There's a lot of rumor mongering, some of it just by social media users, some of it by state-based actors that want to psychologically affect the other side. But I don't think it's inconceivable that some regime officials would have been thinking about the possibility of this day coming and preparing for it. Again, those of us that live in Canada know a lot of regime officials have their money parked in bank accounts here in Canada. They, in many cases, have permanent residency or even Canadian citizenship. They've been thinking about the possibility of escaping. So I think it will happen. But, and aside from this, a footnote here is that I hope our Canadian government takes that threat seriously and is on the lookout for these folks that are fleeing. But I think that's one possible endgame where these folks decide that they just don't want to continue to fight. I actually think that might be one of the best possible outcomes. And in my own sort of small way, I've been encouraging folks that have, some standing in the opposition to actually encourage regime officials to break with the regime, either to come over to the people's side or to just kind of leave the country, take your money and go. And that way you avoid bloodshed and actually hasten the end of this regime.
For the Iranian people. And I mean, in recent years, we've seen a real pushback against the regime, quite a protest movement, as difficult and dangerous as that is for Iranian citizens. At the same time, there's concern, I'm sure, where on the one hand they've got this repressive regime they're living under, on the other hand they're sort of at the mercy of this foreign power and how they're going about this campaign. So, what would your advice be then to the Israelis, keeping all of that in mind?
Great question. I'm actually just working on an op-ed. Not that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to read my suggestions, but it's precisely about this point. Like, what would I recommend? One, I think in the last few days, Israel has been very, very precise in targeting regime officials. Um, I think Israel ought to do everything it can to continue that. It has a fair bit of goodwill, I think, among the Iranian population at the moment. I talk to family members and friends that are in Iran. I read a lot of Iranians on social media. I don't see a lot of anger actually directed at the Israelis. I think that will change the moment Israel decides to change its battle plan and hit Iran more indiscriminately and kill civilians. So I think that's a key point.
Mhm.
Another recommendation I would make is for the Israelis not to try to sort of pick the next Iranian government. Let Iranians kind of work this out for themselves and determine through a democratic process who they want. The idea of bringing in somebody and installing a puppet government is always a bad idea. And then finally, I mean, I think at this moment, it's a very sensitive moment. The Israelis and the Americans and the Canadians, a lot of Western countries can actually step up and help the opposition. The Iranian opposition is very, very fractured, so providing them a mechanism to come together and compromise for a moment. I think they need a little push that would be helpful coming from the West, and also just intelligence, some funding and coordination. I think those things would go a long way in helping the opposition overthrow this regime.
Well, further to that, and some of the points you were making about Canada's situation, I mean, this all looms very large over the G7 summit here in Alberta, obviously. But what more can Canada be doing, both in terms of ensuring that we don't become a safe haven in any sense for Iranian officials, but also helping to move things in the right direction?
Yeah, Canada has a unique role to play. You wouldn't normally think Canada would have a lot to say on Iran, but by virtue of the fact that it is home to a large Iranian diaspora, and by virtue of the fact that the Iranian regime, its officials have decided that this is probably where they want to move to after they're done. It punches above its weight, so to speak. I think we ought to be on the lookout. I think we now have the right legislation in place. It took a long time for us to get there, but I think
Yeah.
now we have the right legislation to be able to actually go after IRGC folks and others that have ties to Iran's regime. But at the moment, it's just statutes written in a book somewhere. There has not been a ton of enforcement. So what I'd want to see is for Canada to actually enforce some of its legislation and actually go after these folks and kick them out of the country and freeze their assets. And in terms of just helping, I think doing precisely what I was just mentioning a minute ago, Canada can play a very constructive role in bringing the Iranian opposition, the democratic opposition, together, allowing them to kind of sort out their differences, giving them funding, giving them training, and helping them basically form a sort of coalition that's needed to be able to dislodge this regime and offer a better alternative.
We'll see where this all goes in the coming days and weeks, and certainly hope for the best possible outcome. Kaveh, really do appreciate your insights on all of this. Thank you so much for making some time for us here.
Thanks so much, Rob.